Hey guys, I know it's been a while, but I'm back with a new video on a topic I never go on about, and that is space setups. Space setups are really complicated. So many different lines, sync tips, rod lengths, and weights. Today I'll try and do my best to go over and cover each topic in some moderate depth. So first thing we'll look at, let's look at rod and reels. Lots of rods out there, made by all sorts of different companies, all with different price points for those with different budgets. When it comes to the weight of the rod, really depends on what you want to do out in the local and not so local rivers. 8 weights for me, they cover everything basically. I can do my pinks, cohos without a problem, but I also have the strength and backbone to cover my chums and the occasional Chinook, and for the guys that pursue the winter ghost. For me, I did notice, however, that 8 weights seemed heavy, or tad bit heavy for pinks and coast, seemed a bit overkill. So if you want to do pink and coast specific and even steelhead specific rod, I'd probably go with a 7 weight Spey rod. But for the sake of effectivity and utility, I'd probably grab an 8 weight Spey just because it covers everything basically. Like for me, my first rod that I got, it was a Redington Claymore in the 8 weight 12'6" model. So obviously with the rod, you gotta put a reel on that sucker. So reel wise, again, lots of different companies, different price points for everyone with a different budget. And obviously you can look at used market as well. You got stuff like Redington, you got Sage, Orvis, Lamson, Nautilus, and Able. That's just to name a couple. When looking at a reel, looking for something with solid drag systems, durability, large arbor. Drag systems and durability speak for themselves. The large arbor part comes into play when you start reeling in your line. So basically, on a reel, right, you've got you have the most inner of your reel, so that's like the smallest diameter. Once you put backing on it and you've got big arbor, that increases the diameter of your reel, and therefore it allows you to reel in more line. So now we look at, how to set up your reel, what you need. So we're going to look at backing, running line, and shooting heads now. So for backing, I always use number 30, or commonly known as 30-pound backing, and a fair amount of it. On my reel, which is the Redington Behemoth at a 910 size, I have 120 or so yards of backing before my running line. The amount of backing, it's going to depend on how much running line you put on as well. So yeah. Another alternative to backing is using anywhere from 40 to 65-pound braid. Braid is slightly more expensive, but I believe it is a much better alternative to backing. Much thinner, it's substantially stronger than backing, it cuts through water much better. A fair amount of spanglers, they'll use 65-pound braided backing when they target Chinooks, because, as we know, Chinooks in the river, infamous for getting hooked, then screaming downstream away from you. And when they're screaming downstream away from you, you need a lot of line so you don't get spooled, and some strong line, and line that cuts through water where it won't have as much, water drag, I guess you could say. So, instead of having 120 yards of 30-pound backing, instead you'll have anywhere from 150 to 180 yards of 65-pound braid. At the end of the day, your backing, it's really going to come down to what you're targeting and how much of a budget you've got. So now for shooting heads, there are basically like three main styles of shooting heads. You got your Skagit heads, Scandi or Scandinavian heads, and you got your traditional lines. And then there's a couple in between to bridge the gaps. So first type of shooting head, that's super common out in the Pacific Northwest, commonly used during the fall and winter. It's going to be our Skagit style of heads. They are the shortest type of heads, and they range anywhere from 13-foot OPSC Commando heads, depending on which grain, and they go up to about 23 to 25 feet, which is Rio Skagit Max Launch, which again, length will depend on the grains. This line has super aggressive tapers, and with all that mass in such a short shooting head, it's meant to cast heavy sink tips with heavy flies and cut through wind. And when I'm talking heavy sink tips, I'm talking 10 feet of T11, 10 feet of T14, 10 feet of T17. And even for the crazy guys who are fishing big high water where you need to bomb it hella deep, even T20. When it comes to casting, we like to use a water anchored cast. So that's going to be guys like the Snap C, your Snap T, your single spay, your parry pokes, even your double spays. Those lines are great because basically when you cast this type of line, you're loading the rod basically by ripping line off the water. That's essentially it. You're basically moving your anchor above you until it's 180 degrees away from where you want to cast, and then you're ripping that line off the water, and that's going to shoot everything out for you. Next, we'll look at Scandinavian heads, or Scandi heads for short. They are usually 30 to 40 feet in length, so fairly longer than, or not really fairly, a tad bit longer than your Skagit heads, depending on what you use. These lines are not going to be casting your heavy T material tips. You can maybe get away with like 5 to 8 feet of T8 at the heaviest, but you're going to most likely be casting polyleaders, versaleaders, or floating tips on these. These lines are quite popular when it comes to chasing summer on steelhead, as they're light and delicate, and they don't land with a huge splat compared to your Skagit lines, which are super fat and heavy. These lines are great when you're casting surface or just under the surface, like barely subsurface flies. And for casting wise, we like to use our touch and go cast with these. So guys like cast like the single spay, snake roll, those are greatly utilized with this type of line. And then lastly, you got your old school traditional lines. This is before a Skagit line and Scandinavian line was ever invented, basically. These lines went from 42 all the way surpassing the 70-foot range and length. They were insane lines, super long. These lines were meant for beast of a rod, like 15-foot plus rods. And yeah, they, like Scandinavian lines, you weren't really casting heavy T material on it. You were doing polyleaders, versaleaders, or floating tips, depending on the situation and what the water was like. So yeah. So after your shooting head, you're gonna have tips: sink tips, floating tips, intermediate tips, all that stuff. So sink tips and stuff like that, it's going to be very dependent upon what head you're using. The head that can cast any sink tip, float tip, intermediate tip, anything like that, that's going to be your Skagit head. The Skagit is like the most versatile line out there. But obviously some lines excel a bit better than the Skagit in certain situations. But aside from that, if you want one head that can do it all, Skagit head can do it all. For your Scandi lines, you want to be using, again, as I said, polyleaders, versaleaders, you know, those lighter, should I say, less dense lines. Those are going to be your go-tos, basically. Those are going to work the best. And then for your long, traditional lines, again, polyleaders, versaleaders, lighter sinking tips, basically. So that right there is going to wrap it up for today's video. If you guys got any questions, drop them down below and I'll try my best to answer them. I'll link a couple of the quote-unquote major spade product producers, so if you guys are interested, you guys can go take a look down below. While you're at it, be sure to hit that subscribe button, as well as go follow me on Instagram at FishingBC with CJ. And again, thanks you guys for tuning in today, today's video. Cheers and take care out there.